Welcome everyone to this session of the Reference Desk, and it's the 23rd and 24th of April, depending on whereabouts in the world you are. And we have a panel of 3 speakers, Louise Mould, and then Bill Collins, and then Ailsa Hedley Leftwich. Now, our 3 panelists have been involved in library and archive administration for quite some time, and thinking also about that professional practice in a Bahai context. They've been in collaboration with each other as well over that time. And so they decided to present collectively, although with their individual ideas about these topics, but there has been a lot of dialogue and consultation between them. So we look forward to hearing from them today. And I'd like to invite Louise to make a start.
Thank you, Graham. I'm just going to share my screen. And Ailsa is the PowerPoint genius, so I'd like to thank her for tweaking mine for me. Today, it's wonderful to see you here, and it's really wonderful to be part of this series of reference desks. And today, I'm going to talk about libraries and librarians, the generality of it. And I'm going to start with a quote, because I like to do that. And the quote is from the Lahi Dunia, and it's "Unveiled and unconcealed, this wronged one hath at all times proclaimed before the face of all the peoples of the world that which will serve as the key for unlocking the doors of sciences, of arts, of knowledge, of well-being, of prosperity, and wealth." I like to think that libraries and archives contribute to that. And so that's why I chose that. I just wanted to give you a little bit of where I spent most of my time. I spent most of my time in university libraries and also the special library at the Bahai World Center. I was cataloging librarian and director of the Bahai World Center Library for a period, cataloging and metadata librarian at the University of Prince Edward Island. And I finally ended up as a librarian at Holland College Library Services, also in Prince Edward Island. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the generalities of libraries and librarians. I'll briefly cover the structure, organization, and needs of libraries. I know we were billed as talking about the World Association of Bahai Librarians and Archivists, but I really don't think we're ready for an association such as the World Association. While it is true that there are Baha'is who are librarians, the associations that they belong to are generally professional in nature. Professional conferences, wherever librarians get together en masse, are organized around the speciality of the librarian or those who work in distinct geographic areas. For example, you have the American Library Association, they have a conference. The Canadian Library Association, they also have a conference. I'm sure the Australians get together as well. There are very few libraries that are Bahai libraries. And so Baha'is who are librarians and who work in Bahai libraries would generally be considered to be working in a special library, which I will cover briefly further on. So special libraries are, it's capitalized. So special and library is capitalized. I'll be highlighting certain issues, some in the field of libraries, because without some kind of base understanding of the complexity of a library or archives, there will always be tensions between the users and the professionals who serve their interests. Most things are complex, libraries are complex, archives are complex, and anything complex has an ever-shifting focus. The structures of libraries. Libraries are organic by nature. They form, they grow, they change and develop. They're rarely entirely digital and rarely entirely print. All libraries share a mission in providing reference, acquisitions or collections, cataloging or metadata. These two they're not interchangeable, but they're more modern terms than the old acquisitions and cataloging. They're part of a larger organization, always dealing with budgets, staffing, and outreach. So serving that organization, of which the library is a part, they report to a governing body of some kind. So all libraries are part of a larger organization. The directors of the library, the heads of the libraries, they report to a governing body. They derive their direction and their funding from that organization. And these organizations are generally not equipped to understand the needs of a library or what a librarian does. And so one of the main missions of the head of a library is to familiarize the boss, if that's an individual or a board, with its needs, both in terms of functions with adequate budget for acquisitions and staffing, and also to provide an understanding of what the job of a librarian is. There's no uniform to wear that says who is a librarian and who is not. So what is it that librarians do? Librarians are information professionals. That kind of gives a bit of a descriptor. What do we do besides cataloging? We do a lot of administration. We hire and supervise staff. We monitor budgets, implement library policies and procedures. We deliver instruction, both one-on-one and in classroom or computer lab environments for students, faculty, others. And we give library orientation sessions. We do collection development, and that includes being a library liaison for designated programs or subject areas, and evaluating resources such as databases and ebook delivery. Now here's special libraries. Now this is important because a Bahai library would be a special library. And it's good to look at the definition of what a special library is. It's a library completely out of the ordinary. And the ordinary, by ordinary, I mean like a public library. Most people, when they think of libraries, they think of public libraries where you go, you borrow a book, or you borrow a DVD, or you borrow something, and the whole family goes. So the definition of a special library is that it is a library that provides specialized information resources on a particular subject. It serves a specialized and limited clientele and delivers specialized services to that clientele. Special libraries include corporate libraries, government libraries, law libraries, medical libraries, museum libraries, news libraries, business libraries, science libraries. You see, you could go on. Special libraries, also exist within academic institutions. These libraries are included as special libraries because they're often funded separately from the rest of the university, and they serve a targeted group of users. So the librarians in special libraries, I have two definitions here. One is from Wikipedia, the other is from the Special Libraries Association. Specialist librarians, who have come to be called information professionals, have a unique relationship as collaborators with their users. Special librarians are information resource experts who collect, analyze, evaluate, package, and disseminate information to facilitate accurate decision-making in corporate, academic, and government settings. I want to briefly touch on collections. In former times, we used to call it acquisitions, and also on the topic of curation of these collections. Materials collected are in print, digital, and digitized. The greater part of what modern libraries have in their collections are vast databases aggregated by a commercial entity. These are usually listed by subject and are often don't have significant metadata. There's a heavy reliance on keyword searching and advanced searching using parameters provided by that commercial entity. So in other words, when you do a search, you put in your terms, and then there are boxes on the side that will limit your search, such as peer-reviewed articles or a date or a range of dates. You can do all that before you do your search. But they are, after all, the information provided is, after all, rented. The moment the bills are not paid is the moment the collection is basically inaccessible. Many of these databases do not provide access to the full text articles or reports. They provide a citation with an abstract, and the user must find the entire article elsewhere. This has parallel applications to ebook providers. We don't get to curate here. This is not curating a collection. This is, we take what is in the database, and that's the deal. That's what you pay for. Bahai materials are so ephemeral that they need to be acquired quickly or they disappear. Materials published under non-Bahai auspices with reference to the Bahai faith vary in significance, and significant reference to the faith is also not straightforward. For example, a book published in English after the Iranian Revolution of 1979 that has a sentence or two about the faith would not be as significant as a book published in English from 1850 or 1860 or 1912. And this is precisely where curation counts. The collections, if they are organized to facilitate meaningful retrieval, will attract users and provide both answers and food for further questions, further research, and acquisitions. Unless we collect the stuff, we don't know what we don't have. Disruption. You can't talk about libraries or archives without talking about disruption. We are basically living in the age of disruption. Libraries and their collections are not going away anytime soon, despite the pundits in the media who talk about the demise of the library. What is evident is that all professions are changing, and changing at a rapid rate. This includes journalists, teachers, professors, medical doctors, mechanics, and the like. To say that because we have Google, YouTube, or Wikipedia, that we don't need libraries is akin to saying that because we have these, we don't need teachers or doctors or any of the professions referenced above. We are in the middle of this revolution and cannot afford to either structure libraries around an old model or a mid-revolution model. And here I need to say that I do go to Google first, and I encourage my students to go there first. It's a brilliant place to find information that will give you a start, to provide you with the language and terminology to then start to effectively search for something else, right? If you don't know, anyway. All of the tools in our boxes are fantastic, but if we haven't developed a vocabulary about a subject, our searching in digital formats for resources that are effectively hidden is limited. Oh, I did have one. Searching hidden resources. All collections must be accessible, and digital collections even more so. Meaningful access in a Bahai library would disallow the search term Bahai, for example. Keyword searching becomes problematic, and we should not always expect to find meaningful results from it. If you cannot assess the relevancy or content of the information retrieved in a timely manner, such searching is futile. Search terms, or the building of a vocabulary by learning, are crucial. In the case of the Bahai writings, both knowledge of the writings and of searching strategies are essential. In the text of the Kitabi Aqdas, for example, there is no mention of Bahai holy days as such. There is no mention specifically of Nowruz, of Rizwan, of declarations, births, or anything else. These terms appear in the notes, the introduction, and the synopsis and codification of the authorized English translation. And so the actual text of the Aqdas, if we do keyword searching, you would not find those terms. But we do find this, and I want to read it because it's so wonderful. It's the language of revelation is elevated and indirect. All feasts have attained their consummation in the two most great festivals, and in the other two festivals that fall on the twin days. The first of the most great festivals being those days whereon the All-Merciful shed upon the whole of creation the effulgent glory of his most excellent names and his most exalted attributes. And the second being that day on which we raised up the one who announced unto mankind the glad tidings of this name, through which the dead have been resurrected, and all who are in the heavens and on earth have been gathered together. Thus hath it been decreed by him who is the ordainer, the omniscient. So there are 3 paragraphs in the Actas, in the text, that talk about holy days, and none of them refer directly to this. And this is what we really need to be careful of when we're searching when we're doing our searches in keyword, as a keyword. I wanted to throw this in instructional services, educational services, and it has to do with information literacy and misinformation. We have to actually do quite a bit of instruction to enable people to be able to discern what is a trustworthy and reliable resource from a source that is fake news. Most users of libraries need some kind of bibliographic instruction that will enable them to use the library effectively. However, the needs of the users are different one from the other. A researcher's needs are different from the needs of an administrative executive or assistant, and from the needs of other kinds of users. This education needs to be ongoing and needs to be instituted as part of an orientation package to new students or employees within the organization. Specialized sessions for those newcomers who will be working closely with library collections would be ideal. And that is the ideal. Most libraries don't get that. I included this because this is in an article that a student doing her master's wrote when she spent a summer or an internship in a library in the technical services. And she wrote, amongst other things, she wrote, access is everything in libraries, and reference and circulation workers can't do their job properly without a catalog. Cataloging may happen behind the scenes, but like other library jobs, its main purpose is always to increase access to information. So cataloging is one of those things that is imperative if you really want to be able to access in a timely manner the information. I have some supplemental reading here. They're just a few things that I thought would be of interest, and I can send them to anybody who would like to. And that is the end. And it was so brief and so quick. I have so much more to say, and I really restrained myself, and you'll be happy to hear that I did. And so that's the end of that. Take it away, Bill.
All right. I'm going to share my screen. Let's make sure that you can see this. Can you see that?
Thanks, Bill. We can.
All right. Now I have to make the Zoom window a little smaller. Okay. So I wanted to thank Louise for doing the kind of what's a library sort of questions, because I think there's still among many people is a kind of a misunderstanding about what goes into making it work. So so now I want to just touch on some things that I think are issues or questions that will need to be addressed over time. Let me see if I can get, okay. I don't know that I need to introduce myself, do I, to everyone as to who I am?
Well, Bill, actually, some people may come across you for the first time,
okay.
Looking at not the people online at the moment, but others who do this in the future.
That's fine. So I'm Bill Collins, and I have been a librarian since 1973, and worked in libraries for 2 or 3 years before that. I have a master's from Syracuse University in library science and also a master's from the same institution in social science, and served at the Middlebury College Library, the State Historical Society Library of Wisconsin, at the Bahai World Center for 13 years, and then at the Library of Congress for 27 years. And among other things, have written a number of things about the Baha'i faith and libraries, and also prepared a bibliography of English language works on the Baha'i and Baha'i faiths 1844 to 1985. So that's just a few things. So I wanted to start with the vision, because I think this is important for us to kind of see where the issues are. So the International Baha'i Libraries and Institution hasn't really been founded as an institution yet at the Baha'i World Center, but the Universal House of Justice explained that this library is the central depository of all literature published on the faith, on the Baha'i faith, and is an essential source of information for the institutions of the World Center on all subjects relating to the cause of God and the conditions of mankind. In future decades, its functions must grow. It will serve as an active center for knowledge in all fields, and it will become the kernel of great institutions of scientific investigation and discovery. And this is where I think the International Baha'i Library is going to, at some point, depart from being merely a special library, and as it will be an active center for knowledge in all fields. So the other is at the local and national level. The place of the library and archives in the Haziratul Quds, the Baha'i Center, will, as its component parts such as the archives and the library are brought together and made jointly to operate in one spot, be increasingly regarded as the focus of all Baha'i administrative activity and symbolize in a befitting manner the ideal of service animating the Baha'i community in its relation alike to the faith and to mankind in general. So that's kind of the vision of where libraries fit in at the international, national, and local level. So I just want to touch on a few things that have happened over the past 3 decades or so. So first there's the World Association to Promote Baha'i Libraries and Archives, better known as WABLA. As, you always have to have an acronym. So it was proposed at the first International Conference of Bahai Librarians and Archivists at Landig in January 2003, and it had initial board of directors that hasn't been replaced at all in this time: Bill Collins, Ailsa Hedley Leftwich, and Darlene Valeda. And we did make a number of attempts to get organized and to really kind of get commitment, and it clearly needed a different kind of organic development because there was limited ongoing interest, and we were challenged with the constantly changing staffing at Bahai Libraries and Archives, often of untrained volunteers who would need on-site training that the limited numbers of us, were simply not able to do. I did it actually in 2 places, at 2 schools in the United States. But it requires a lot of attention. So we often, Louise knows this, Ailsa knows this, I know this from our various positions in Baha'i libraries and archives, that we would often get untrained volunteers asking, how do I catalog the library collection? And how do I classify books? Well, you can't answer this in a 1-page letter or a 5-page letter. It actually requires training to be able to manage these things. And so so this raises the question of training in the Baha'i library and archives context. How do we reach that point of having things available? There is a Baha'i Library and Archives website that I created originally right after 2003, and then it got it kind of disappeared and then got reconstituted in July 2019, and not intended as a site for aggregating Baha'i texts, but as a site focused on the toolkit for library and archives workers serving in Baha'i-related institutions and collections. And I just want to show you, so this is, if you haven't been to it, BahaiLibraryandArchives.org. and go and explore, but it has a home page, about page that explains some things about Bahai Libraries and the World Association. News and calendar are under construction because we don't have anything to put there. We have information about libraries, including how to classify. So there are a number of Bahai classifications. We have information about archives with things about collecting and guidance from the Bahai writings, the guidelines for local assemblies from the United States, and the German Bahai Archives workshop items. We have a space for duplicates, but I, again, don't have anything working yet with Peter Terry and some other people to actually put up duplicates for libraries to ask for or exchange. I don't think I have anything in the gallery yet. I have some links. No FAQ. There's a contact. And then we do have a Bahai Librarians and Archivists Facebook page. And I suspect some of you are not in it. It is specifically designed, this page is specifically designed for those who are involved in some way in Bahai libraries and archives and collections. It's not primarily for people, somebody who says, well, I have a nice collection of Bahai books, I'd like to join. It's really for people who are deeply engaged in the whole process of libraries and archives. So let me get back to the PowerPoint. Can you see that again? I hope.
Yes, Bill, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm just going to move off to a little bit to talk about professional training and standards. You know, Louise kind of gave a hint that there's more to this than meets the eye. Staffs in libraries and archives need training and understanding of standards, and this is an ongoing challenge for Bahai libraries and archives, because we're primarily at the local and even the national level relying upon volunteers who simply may have the interest but not the background and the training and the preparation to know and be able to follow professional standards. So so I want to show just really quick here, and we're going to send this PowerPoint around so that you can look at this. But my alma mater, the Syracuse University School of Library and Information Science, School of Information Studies, you can see that to obtain the 1 year, it's a full calendar year master's degree, requires six core courses and electives from another some 20 some or 30 courses. Everything from telecommunications to human interaction with computers to theory of classification and subject representation. So it's a really large field that you can even specialize in. So, so we have policies and ethical standards for managing and preserving records and publications. We have, and these policies are extremely important. And if any of you have been watching news relating to public libraries in particular in the United States, you will see that even though libraries have policies for handling complaints regarding books, it has now become politicized where politicians are trying to take over libraries, remove their boards so that they can then decide what books that they don't like should be removed. Primarily those involving race, gender, and LGBTQ questions. So these are the kinds of issues that come up as to why policies are needed and why also support is needed from those who govern the library. There are standards of description and classification, such as resource description and access, and there are enormous books about this stuff to handle all the problems that one runs into. Classification systems, there are several. not just Dewey and Library of Congress. There's Universal Decimal, there's colon classification, there are whole bunches of them. Indexing methods and vocabularies. Do you have controlled subjects, tags, text, all three? And then catalogs and finding aids. And how do you merge the catalogs of internal and external records and physical and digital resources? I'm not going to speak a lot about bibliography right now because that's really been handled in 2 or 3 of the previous discussions, but I have in EndNote now everything that was in my bibliography that was published, plus quite a few additional records. And this is incomplete and not publicly available, and still has not been checked with Steve Cooney's database of references, and they need to be compared and checked and additional things added. Or the two need to be combined in some form, which is why the Association for Bahai Studies has been exploring creating topical annotated bibliographies from reliable sources, looking toward a step towards something more comprehensive. There are issues when it comes to the ABS because of concern about including anything that is work by those who have broken the covenant, enemies, or mentally unstable individuals. And so there's limitation on comprehensiveness about stuff that is ephemeral. Now, Bahai Library, Jonah is here, I know, is exploring an online consolidated bibliographic database. So this is a question, an issue hanging in the air. So how do we sustain into the future the bibliographic efforts and the aggregating works efforts? You know, the bibliographic, Collins, Cooney, others. The aggregating is BahaiLibrary.com, Bahai Works, and BahaiArc.org. That's the one in Russia. And I'm sure that there are others who have, that are probably not known or less known that are going. How do we extend those into the future? So then, finally, the question of university and research library collections. How do we create a recommending task force that establishes relationships with selected institutions to offer ongoing recommendations of materials to collect based on those libraries' acquisitions policies? How do we build Bahai collections in academic libraries and archives? So this is stepping outside of just the purely Bahai library and archive situation, but where there are Bahai materials in other places. So there are individuals who have donated to some academic institutions. Otto Donald Rogers donated his papers to the University of Regina in Saskatchewan. Will Vanden Hoenaard donated papers to the University of New Brunswick. And then Jack and Arden Lee donated a large library of materials to Stanford University, which Stanford is enlarging. Is there a way ultimately to have endowed positions and collections in libraries and archives? I understand from Stanford, the person who's handling that if somebody wanted to give $1 or $2 million as an endowment, they could hire a librarian who would spend nothing but their time and money in the endowment on Bahai materials. But they have to, they don't have that. So one librarian overseeing the special collections is dealing with that. I've been the Bahai recommender for the Library of Congress for 3 decades. And this involves making sure that I know the Library of Congress collection policies well enough to recommend to them the materials that I think go with their collection. So not every book published about the Bahai faith is going to go in their collection, but there are certain ones that I know because they're either primary sources or they are great academic studies, that type of thing that we make sure that they get. So how do we place knowledgeable Baha'is in positions where they are bringing to the attention of acquisitions librarians the best and most useful Bahai materials? And then there's also correcting errors in library cataloging records. And this generally needs a good eye for catching when the Library of Congress, that has trained people, makes mistakes and puts something by Abdul Baha under Baha'u'llah. And it's done frequently enough that I that I become exasperated. But it's one of those ongoing issues that we have to have people who are in a position to make those recommendations. And then finally, I just wanted to share this letter on behalf of Shoghi Effendi from July 1925 to the Bahais of the East. Anyone who spontaneously and of his own free will donates material to the archives of his National Spiritual Assembly, whether this be tablets, books, pictures, objects, or the like, and I'm also going to throw papers, personal papers in there, and especially if the inheritors are not accounted of the people of Baha, or are not considered by him as trustworthy or reliable, will have performed a highly meritorious act in the sight of God, and his name will be perpetuated in the records of the spiritual assemblies, and his memory enshrined in the archives forever. So this is, tremendous encouragement for Baha'is to donate tablets, books, pictures, objects, and papers to archives. So, issues summarized. Current role for WABLA, improvements to the librarians and archivists website, sustaining individual bibliographic and aggregating efforts in the future. I've skipped one. I missed putting in there training for Baha'is who are working in libraries and archives. Online updatable accessible bibliographic database or published bibliographies. Task force to recommend reliable Baha'i-related resources to libraries and submit corrections for erroneous records, and encourage gifts to Baha'i libraries and archives and academic libraries. So that's a big basket of issues right there. Shall I pass it off to Ailsa?
Okay, I will share my screen and I can see you. Can you see this?
All set, thank you.
Okay, so as the primary purpose of this loose-knit group of Baha'i librarians and archivists, one of our goals is to not only link professionals in the Baha'i community, but also individuals without professional training who are working to assist assemblies and other institutions in this field. As I often find that many are not aware of some of the specifics of the archival profession, I'm including in this presentation a very brief explanation of the functions and activities of archives and a bit about the education or theory upon which this work is based. This presentation includes a bit of the work done in the broader archival community that might help find some answers to some of the questions that have been raised in this series of webinars. And then this slide just shows a bit of my professional background, education, and experience for context. At present, and for some time, the most major part is that I've the archivist for the National Assembly of the Bahais of Canada, with some good experience at the World Centre as well. So first I'm going to talk about some characteristics of archives. There's some features of them that require a somewhat different approach to their management and use from published resources. They are the unself-conscious residue and evidence of the functions and activities that created them by a specific creator. They're distinguished from published materials that are usually managed by libraries that were created to transmit to an audience a specific story, information, body of work, etc. That is, that were consciously created and that are publicly available. Some characteristics of archives: they are impartial, authentic, natural, interrelated, and unique. This is literally the basis for a whole course in a master's, the whole course in a master's course on archives. So I won't have time to get into it here, but some features will kind of come up. There are two principles from RAD, is the Rules for Archival Description here in Canada. Respect des fonds, which has the two principles are the principle of provenance. That is, that the records created, accumulated, and or maintained by an individual or organization must be represented together and distinguishable from the records of any other creator. They must not be intermingled. The second one is original order. That is, the order of the records that established by the creator should be maintained by physical and or intellectual means whenever possible to preserve the existing relationships between records and the evidential value inherent in this order. So you can't go in to a body of work and think, okay, this is how I'm going to organize it. You have to study it, know it, understand the person, the organization. And so, and you'll find records at the font or the creator level, series, file, and item levels. When I went to university, I learned that one can identify, oops, go back. Oh no, come back. Sorry about that. Very sensitive mouse. There's stages in the development of an archival institution. Here's a little shot of one of our storage facilities that we had, don't have it right now, and the policy statement that we established. Phase 1 is rescuing materials and cultural artifacts from wherever they need to be rescued, whether the host organization or around the community. The second phase is establishing the legal authority, such as this policy statement you see here, and institutional infrastructure to carry the activity on. So developing the institution, you establish policies and procedures, you develop records management, for example. The third phase is a maturation phase to manage and maintain. For example, integrating records creation and records management systems, establishing procedures and facilities to receive researchers, and integrating and collaborating into a network of other heritage institutions and information networks. Now, I've learned that these stages are overlapping. They're not necessarily consecutive. I'd venture that many Bahai archives are still at phase 1, even if they've developed some tools, procedures, and sophistication that are evident in later stages. I still think it's helpful to think of these stages when thinking about our vision and also about what might be realistic at any given time. So what do archivists do? These are the main functions. We acquire records through records management programs in our own institutions and through donations from private individuals, companies, or organizations that fit the acquisition policy. Part of that, we appraise records, determine what belongs in the archives. We try to observe boundaries with other institutional policies. We collaborate rather than compete. Just for a quick example, Louise here found some papers of an individual who had pioneered in Canada, but most of the time was in the US. We determined it should go to the US and not to us, but we kind of keep a connection on that. Records management is often a major component of the work, identifying series, retention periods, tracing the organizational history because it changes, and looking at its functions and activities, a function, for example, being property management. And we also look at the custodial history, which helps determine ownership, copyright, chain of custody, which relates to authenticity of the materials. We arrange and we describe the records. This is kind of similar to cataloging, but is done for multi-level description. And we preserve records through facilities and procedures, security measures, climate control, conservation treatment, and reformatting where required. And we provide access according to the mandates of the organization. As Louise said earlier, the archives is embedded within the institution, and that's the context within which we operate. We have to balance support for research, which we support, with institutional requirements, laws, human and physical resources, and preservation. Now, specifically to do with arrangement and description, there are standards. The Society of American Archivists has a handbook. I just discovered recently that there's about over 300 standards that archivists might be working with, many of them outside of their own profession. Within the archives profession, I threw up images of 4 standards with which I'm a little bit familiar, some more than others. There's an international standard for archival description, ISADG. I'm quite versed in the rules for archival description, or RAD, here in Canada. Britain has the manual for archival description, and the US, I understand, has recently switched, I don't know how recently, to DACS, Describing Archives of Content Standard. Why do we have these standards for description? This allows for networking and for researchers to have a standard expectation of how they might have a way into the collections. So you can have, they might have additional finding aids that are in addition to what you have for a network, but it does allow for collaboration. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This is from Memory Saskatchewan, where I live in Saskatchewan in Canada. Now, MemorySask is an internet network that uses the Atom open source software. The inputs into all the records that are in here are based on the rules for archival description. In terms of support to institutions, the Council, Saskatchewan Council for Archives and Archivists, has an archives advisor. He provides professional support to inputting institution. And there is one of the institutions as part of this network that agrees to host this network, the University of Saskatchewan. The image that I have on the screen is for Richard St. Barbe Baker. And most of you might be familiar with him, the man of the trees, notable Bahai conservationist. He happens to be buried here in Saskatoon. Now, this is an example of how, I wanted to present this as an example of how we might conceive of networking in the Baha'i community. So at the top, you can search for his name, and then the results that come up are, there's photographs, there's his phone, his own papers, there's references in other people's phone or collections. So, and you can also look and see which institution hosts. Through this, when I was putting this together, I realized University of Regina Archives also has a very small collection of his that I didn't know existed. Okay, so now the Saskatchewan network feeds into the Canadian network, Archives Canada. It has the same structure underlying it, and the St. Barbe Baker search leads to many of the same hits, but presented slightly differently. Going back to MemorySask, I clicked on the phone description for Richard St. Barbe Baker phone at the University of Saskatchewan, and you can see here, I'm sorry it's faint, I was really hard to try to represent this on the slide, but you can see the elements of description. There's a title and statement of responsibility area, dates of creation, physical description, so you get a sense of how much, when you're going to research, how much am I going to have to work through. Then there's a descriptive portion, a bit about Richard St. Barbe Baker, the scope and content of the material in the phone, and the arrangement. So the series that you see here are listed. There are Baha'i records included in the series on religious activities and health, for example. There's a statement about restriction on access. There are none. However, but you have to follow the Copyright Act in publication of any of these. And they are picky. I've talked to the archivists there. So, you know, so having this as a model really helps, I think striving towards it helps us to become professional. And so that's that. Now, another function that I just wanted to touch on a little bit is, as I whip through my notes here, preservation, which includes facilities, climate, security, rehousing. I just want to point out, first of all, that conservation and preservation are not the same thing. They both work to preserve or prolong the life of objects, but conservation is hands-on work to stabilize or restore objects, for example, removing layers of dirt or bringing something in that had been removed. Preservation is non-invasive and to minimize deterioration. So taking this box that you see on the left, putting them into boxes such as on the top left, is one example. Monitoring collections for pests, and practicing proper handling, and so on. Now, we also look at conservation treatment where necessary, disaster preparedness, reformatting, digitization to reduce handling. It increases access. Digitization is not usually a replacement for originals. It can help originals by reducing wear and tear on the original, but what this has done now is create a second item to be preserved. Electronic records, including digital surrogates, require active and continuous management to preserve. We need equipment to read them always. We need human resources in place continuously. Now, it's interesting, but this box that you see on the bottom left, this contains some of the records of one of the first National Assembly members of Canada, and it had been in somebody's basement for 20 years. Well, most of that content was fine, but the little memory sticks and hard drives you see on the right, if they'd been neglected for that long, they would be completely useless. So it has to be continued to be maintained. Okay, just touching a little bit more on digitization. One thing that's really important in that is to maintain the context of creation. So we digitize for access, not to replace originals. Before they're digitized, they have to be understood, arranged, and described so as to present images in their creation, in the context of their creation. So here you have a slide coming from a set of slides from Richard Stanton, who was Knight of Baha'u'llah for Kuwaitan district in the north of Canada. Northwest Territories it was then, now it's Nunavut. He actually, when he gave them to us, he'd already arranged them into sets. So we just needed to kind of import his descriptions and so on into our database. Now, but the slides themselves contain some metadata of sorts, some information that weren't present in his descriptive content. So I thought it would be nice in digitizing them to also capture that, even though we are going to keep the original slides. Those slides are now protected from more handling because they're accessible this way. Now a note about access, which is a whole other topic. So the Universal House of Justice wrote to an individual in 1999, there is tremendous work to be accomplished in sorting, identifying, and cataloging such documents so that they can be effectively studied without either damaging them or losing vital information by disturbing their interrelationships. So we need to develop access policies. Access policies developed according to the creator of the records. For example, a local or national assembly or a bank, city council, and so on. Records that are confidential, sensitive, proprietary, may not be publicly accessible ever, or maybe not for 100 years. For example, in Canada, the census records, which are a really major resource, it's 100 years before you can get access. Records created are maintained for the creator. And when all the reasons why they needed to be kept secure have passed, whatever that institution has determined, then they might be made accessible. And then separately, proper arrangement and description before access is required. This policy protects materials from disturbance before the archivist has had an opportunity to examine and process them. That allows us to focus on what is actually of use to researchers, and it may protect individuals identified in the records from the release of sensitive information. Just a few other issues that are related to access and privacy and copyright. We really have to be aware of copyright, which varies all over the world. In Canada, the general guideline, is life of the author plus 50 years, but there's a bunch of exceptions and so on. Possession of a negative or a book does not equal holding copyright. That doesn't mean just because you have it, just because somebody scanned it, that you can just publish it. Fair dealing, which is in copyright acts in Canada, the UK, and Australia, and fair use in the US and Israel, for example, there's different subtleties. That's what proportion of a material are you allowed to copy for personal research versus publication and so on. We also looked at orphan works where you don't know who actually created the thing. We also look at access to information and protection of privacy, which has to be understood in the context of creation. Who is the institution? Is it a government institution, in which case it's subject to the federal act? Was it a provincial organization, in which case it's subject to provincial legislation? Or is it a private institution, such as a National Assembly? It doesn't actually apply, but a lot of the principles can be observed. And then we also look at researcher guidelines in terms of handling, physical handling, the use of information, providing guidelines on how to cite works, because sometimes people just don't know. And archival material is a little more complex than other items. Another area where we work is in guidance to local assemblies. And a big issue lately has been storing records in the cloud. Confidential records, should you not? If so, how? How do you make sure that's not discovered and so on? So those are some issues. I'm just about done my portion here. So I just wanted to speak a little bit archival education, because the group that's in this webinar, whether you're professionals or not, you are connected to archives, and you're connected to other people who you might think might actually be interested in pursuing a career in this area. So I just wanted to throw up here. These are at my alma mater, the University of British Columbia, what the current major coursework is in there. And now the International Council of Archives, most countries have national archival associations that can help people find where to study in their country. The International Council of Archives also provides training in especially challenging places, so that most countries have some way of finding training. Within the Baha'i community, there's a little bit here and there. In the Wilmette Institute has a course that I helped out with at the beginning of it, which has helped quite a number of people in local archives to learn about archives. But what we need more archivists in the Baha'i community who can draw on the theory that the archival profession has developed and who have an understanding of Baha'i administration. Both are needed to advance the field of Baha'i archives. And again, I have a few resources here, which will probably end up on the Bahai Library and Archives.org website. But that is the end of my presentation.
Well, Ailsa, thank you very much, and to Louise and to Bill for this really outstanding presentation of the issues that we need to consider as we develop libraries and archives in a Baha'i context. So welcome some questions from everybody who's present. Thanks. Alexander, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I wish I had this presentation some 10 years ago, when I was nominated to become librarian and archivist for the NSA of Germany. And even though I asked at the Universal House of Justice or the World Center, the answer was there's no information at all, full stop. So I developed the whole thing, what you have just laid out here, on my own, more or less. And I'm very curious to find out how far I'm off from the ideal. The main question I have is not to the past or the task. The main question I have is, because I'm stuck with that here in Germany, is how do you, and this is a question to you all, three please, how do you think of the last 20 years to cover that in terms of archives and libraries? Because the experience I made over here is there's hardly any information available. Let me give you an example. There was 3 years ago a conference for the youth in Niedernhausen in Germany, close to the House of Worship. And when I was asking for any outcomes, there was a big surprise by the organization or the organizers, and said, what do you mean? I said, well, there was a conference, 800 youth were invited. Where's the invitation? Where's the handouts? Where's the results of it? And it turned out there was nothing, not a single page existing. We're talking about thousands of photos on handies on everybody of any Baha'i meeting. And if you ask somebody after 2 or 3 years, may I have a copy of that? These are all gone because they have changed their their cellular, you know. So how do you think about how we cover the last 20 years? Right, the digital desert.
Clearly, every country we need to develop capacity. We need people to study archives and library and to be employed or volunteer, however each country can manage, to educate the community and the institutions on the need for this. Because, you know, there's in archives, when we look at records management and there's kind of the administrative functions to just kind of keep the institution going, and then there's the functions. And so many people working for national assemblies are so focused on the mission at hand that they don't necessarily think about the background. It's less urgent in some ways. And so yeah, all I can say is just developing capacity and adapting it to the country in place. So encourage people to study, and we'll try to get up some more resources, I think, on this webpage about studying. To me, I feel like that's a real priority, because the theory behind these disciplines is quite extensive, and I had no idea what I was getting into when I started the master's program. Things that I thought were dry and uninteresting were fascinating to me.
Yes, you're right.
And provide an ability whenever things come up. I often go back to some of the same material or to, through my networks to people or resources that help me solve the issue. Whereas if I had none of that training, I would just give up.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is from Andrew.
I just wanted to jump in for a minute.
Go ahead, Bill, and then Andrew.
That is one thing that I learned very quickly in my own community is that because over the last 20 years, most of what was prepared as letters and minutes and so on was all done electronically, and all sorts of communications were in email. And I adopted what is basically the recommendations of the National Bahai Archives, which is do not rely on electronic versions of your communications and your reports to be the record. And I take care of our physical archives. We have a storage facility with file cabinets, and I ensure that every single important communication is printed and put there in the event that something happens to the electronic version, because we have to have the record. And then the other thing is, I think Ailsa raised a really important point about the institutions beginning to carry out their correspondence and maintain their records in the cloud. For instance, as with what is it called, G Suite, with Google Suite, or with Microsoft 365 for business. That if you do that, you still need to have a way of retaining a physical copy somewhere to ensure, because as Ailsa said, you have to maintain and preserve the electronic copies. And what format is it in? Is it as some of our early things were, in WordPerfect format, which is not the standard now, or something else, and how do you convert? So these are things that you have to solve with your particular situation, what your reality is.
Thank you, Bill. To Andrew.
Hi, thank you very much to the three of you. My question has to do with the economic viability of libraries and the shift to digital information and models of rental of per use models. Does that affect the economic sort of viability of libraries? Is it more expensive to run libraries, and is that a threat?
Uh, I guess yes and no. I'm looking at Louise and Ailsa also on this. There are too many things. The changes are happening so fast, and there are too many things that we still have to learn about. I mean, in the United States, libraries are trying to become lenders of ebooks. The book publishers are fighting it tooth and nail because they want everybody to buy the rights to an individual one for them. They don't want a library to buy it and then lend because it makes less money. And so I don't think there's a threat to libraries so much from that. I mean, I'm going to be quite frankly, a little political. I think the threat to libraries comes from political maneuvering to remove funding from libraries to put on other things that are less important, because in fact libraries, public libraries in particular, are a public good, and they are something that is essential to have an educated populace and people who are good citizens. And if you keep starving it, you are actually deteriorating the civic good of your society. So I think the threat is less from digital than it is from the failure to understand the public good that a library is.
Yeah, I
Right.
think that's the education that libraries have to give to the public also depends on the library, right? There are some special libraries that are just desks where the librarian or the information professional, their job is to go through all of these digital reports, looking for articles about a specific subject that the research institution, scientific research institution, for example, it's the hot topic of the moment. So they go through that, they pull up all these references, and then they compile them into a report on a weekly basis. They send them off to these people and they say, okay, we want this one and this one, can you get it? So you have to then go find it in other libraries. And that's something that, that is costly, but libraries are costly. They're not, you can't do a library on the cheap. It's just impossible because you don't get the expertise. And you don't get the ability to purchase what you need for that collection. And I'll tell you, I worked for one winter in a government department where they were cutting the library to the point where I could not buy anything. I could continue with the subscriptions, but I couldn't buy anything. And this very important book came out, and it was exactly what the newspapers in Canada, it was a government department that was federal, and the newspapers were all on their case, and it was this big thing. And I said, look, we need this book. And the person who managed the library knew nothing about it. And she had to take the cost of this book, buying this book, which was $15, up to the deputy director to get approval to buy that book. And that is the state where so many libraries are at, that it's pathetic in a way that our societies, which are so educated, which have such a high level of expertise, don't understand that basic level of a library, what it is and what it does. Anyway, that's a rant.
I wanted to mention, so that this is on the recording here, that Steve Cooney made a point that it's true. This is less of a threat for special libraries because vast amounts of Baha'i material is not in digital format yet, even in 2022. And I would say from my experience at the Library of Congress, when you have libraries that have enormous amounts of material, the cost of digitizing is not cheap. So, you know, somebody has to do this, and it costs to do that. And even then, the digitized form is not a substitution for the actual item and the evidentiary value in the item, because often you can see things in the item that you can't see just with text that's been copied. The other thing I would say is regarding budgets. People tend to think that Google is free. You know that there are billions of dollars behind that in advertising and all sorts of other things, that they're making money off of you. So the idea that libraries should be defunded because they're too costly fails to understand the costs that are going into all of these other things that you think are, you know, free, but they're not.
All right. Well, thanks for those questions about what we might call the political economy of the modern library. Alexander, did you have another question? Use your hand up once more.
Yes, I have one question which is important to me. Coming back to the what you mentioned, that archivists or archives cost as well. The libraries do cost, but it's not only a cost side. I've learned in my times as a consultant to implement changes into firms that you can also see not only the liabilities but also the assets. And if you say it's a must for the population to have a library because of benefits, then these, let's say, not monetary items of value should be some sort measurable to show the community or the head of whoever is in charge of the budget to show what the value is. Because if nobody uses the library at all, why do you have a library? Just in case of, or just for the future, or for future generations, as we often say, that's not the case. And there's a big difference. Or anyhow, what I felt was in the UK when I was there for 2 years, the library is a social center where the people do meet, talk, and exchange ideas. In Germany, it's slightly different. It's not a pile of paper and you do research in it. So there's a different mentality of it. But what I wanted to express is, why don't we look for what the assets is of a library or the profits, and we quantify it at the end of the day. Admittedly, it's sometimes not easy, but it's not impossible.
Thank you. And move to Steve Collins.
So I wanted to take the question of, and thank you for the presentations. I wish I had learned all of these things decades ago. If a library is a public good, which I completely agree with, and a library can serve all of these functions that have sort of been talked about, not only as an intellectual gathering place, but a physical gathering place, space. Why don't we have a Bahai public library? I mean, aside from the theoreticals of administrative choices, why isn't there a culture of saying we should have a library and this is what we should be doing?
If I could respond to that, I don't think we're there yet. You know, we don't really have. Are you talking about a public lending library for Baha'is, or are you talking about
an open-ended
there are
question?
Baha'i libraries. Sorry.
It's an open-ended question.
Okay.
I experience as kind of a semi-working historian, I run into why I have to keep justifying history to Baha'is, that this matters, that people lived, that people died, that they actually did something and tried to do something. And it occurred to me, well, what about libraries? We have Baha'i centers in which there might be some books, but there's not a lot of knowledge about that. So for example, I gathered some Baha'i science fiction that was published, and I gave it to a Baha'i center in my area, complete separate copies, and I have my own set of copies. And these are like a sort of a lending set, if you will. And most of the awareness that I see in Baha'i communities about libraries and librarians are people who you can buy books from. But that broader mission of a library that we're saying is a public good Why do people call Bahai Library Online as the most great library? It seems to me that there should be, and I know there what used to be, at least I remember seeing references to an actual officer position in assemblies of an archivist and a historian. An actual office of an assembly would be an archivist or historian. What's going on? Where are we at? What does this mean? What should we be doing?
Well, I think, Stephen, that there are a whole set of developments historically that lead to, part of it leads to confusion. At least in the United States, for a long time, the Baha'i Publishing Trust basically recruited in every community a, quote, librarian who purchased books and sold them. Complete misnomer. I asked many times for that to be changed, because it's not a librarian. That's a bookseller. And so that created a misnomer. But often the person who was, quote, the librarian in obtaining books also got a discount. Now, this doesn't happen anymore. I don't think this works anymore. But they got a discount so that they could purchase books for the local Baha'i community library. It turned out that those were, I think, on the whole, difficult to maintain because, as Louise said, we haven't developed to that level, organic level yet to sustain it. And if you look at when does the House of Justice now, it's made clear when there will be national and local houses of worship. And it's not because there are Baha'is in a community. It's because they've reached a certain level of development. And I think that that's where we are with libraries. The House of Justice had goals, I know, in earlier plans to have local lending libraries in India. That's the only country where I know that this was done. And I don't know what ever happened to them. If the state, it was a learning process. I don't know what was learned from it. I have no idea. And I think this is the challenge we have, is that we're not at the level of development to sustain that, except at the international and national level, and maybe in certain local communities that have a lot of believers, with a big Baha'i center that has a room dedicated to a library. The Northern Virginia Baha'i Center has a library room. So we have one. And so, they do exist, but we're not at that level of development. I've gone on too long about this, but it's, you get the idea. We're just not there to sustain it.
Right, so our sort of society hasn't congealed to the level of having that
It
level
hasn't
of action.
congealed to the right number of people to have that focus, which is also why I think why it's Baha'i institutions underfund the archives and libraries.
Right.
I just think that's
in the archivist flavor of things, by the way. This last winter, I took a trip and met with I'm not sure how old he is, 60-something-year-old Baha'i, who's like the archivist, because there used to be a community, and he's got file cabinets in his house, and he's like, this is not a sustainable plan. We need some place where this is going to be kept. And then I was made aware that LGI apparently has a room that's an archives, but nobody manages it, or so I was told. I don't know the truth of things independently. So, I appreciate that there's a challenge on the library side and on the archivist side.
WLGI has that. Let the National Baha'i Archivists, Ed Sefcik, know that they have an archives there that's not being cared for. He'll deal with it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that. So we've got about 10 minutes left. And of course, the whole purpose of the series is, in a sense, a reboot of the original conference in 2003. The Landig conference was to assess what the condition was of Baha'i libraries and archives, in a sense, in a pre-digital era, but with an intent to begin to coordinate an understanding of the current situation and the developmental needs. And Bill has explained how those first efforts were put in place, and some progress was made, but not sufficient. And I think the purpose of this series is to, in a sense, reboot those same questions in the digital era. And when we are online together, it's a precious time that we have together to try to identify those strategies that we can formulate and implement as we go forward. So it's an opportunity for us to look forward as much as to lament the condition of the situation. We need to understand the situation, but the purpose in coming together is to find positive steps into the future. Just one or two more questions to follow. Steve Cooney, please.
Yeah, thanks. So just harking back to one of Bill Collins's bullet points, is just around what to do with material that falls into the oppositional camp or the covenant breaker camp. Because in a comprehensive library, you'd probably have a few exemplars of such material, but I'm not sure that there's enough understanding within the community of the value of such things. Or maybe there should be a specialist library that just focuses on that, but it's very ephemeral material. It's not a general threat to the Baha'i community, but you can make defense of faith arguments and just arguments on comprehensiveness. So I'd be interested in how you think about that, Bill, because I do have a small amount of that material, but I am quite anxious that it will be possibly thrown out or discarded if not managed carefully.
Yeah, the point that I was making had to do with bibliography. So this is just the bibliography. It's not even the material itself.
Yeah, I'm talking about the material.
And in the case of ABS, it has certain requirements and concerns about including in a bibliography things that are oppositional or seditious. And that's, and I think that that's something that the institutions sponsoring ABS have to wrestle with in terms of, but as far as anybody else doing it, I mean, I think if Jonah, gets something going on the BahaiLibrary.org site, and it can include all of these things, and one can categorize it and explain what it is and give it a context.
Yeah.
In my view, it's better to give it a context than to deny that it exists.
I agree.
I've had this conversation before because I have a few things over on one of my shelves here. It's not with my other Baha'i books, but I have a few things that have fallen into my hands that are in the category of inauthentic, questionable, anti, and seditious material. And I have it so that I get the basic idea of what the arguments are. Don't believe any of them for a minute because they're silly. But to at least have a reference to it that says this thing exists is not a problem as long as you give it context. So
Yeah.
I've gone on too much again about it, but it's the context.
There's also the ethics of collecting, isn't there? An aspect of that as well, being fairness and. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else had a comment. Louise, Ailsa?
No, I think it's been covered by your answer, Bill. Just a few minutes left for maybe anybody who hasn't yet asked a question or made a comment. It seems to me that we've covered the development of Baha'i libraries and archives within a Baha'i context, but another interesting aspect of the presentations was the availability of content in other institutional libraries, whether it be academic or governmental, state libraries, etc., which has Baha'i content as part of a larger persona of a person who is in that collection. And there's also the question of individual initiatives that fall outside of institutions. So individual collections and initiatives as compared to institutional. And then a fourth important dimension to these presentations was the need to develop these capacities within Baha'i communities. And again, harking back to the Land Egg conference, I think the intent was to try to raise awareness amongst national communities about the importance of Baha'i archives and the development of library services. So that's an ongoing challenge. There's at least 4 important themes that have come out of these presentations so far. Just a last opportunity to ask questions. Steve, is your hand still up, or is that your last hand?
Oh, it's my last date.
Okay, all right. Maybe back to our presenters for any final thoughts, things that you thought later that you might want to add to your presentations before we finish. Maybe back to Louise and then Ailsa as well. Any final comments before we sign off for today?
No, I'm okay. Thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't really have anything specific. There's so many different directions conversations could go. So
yeah, I have 1,000 things that I could say, but that would be too much. The one person I feel we didn't hear from, I know we're at the end of the time, is that we have Mujan here from the Afnan Library, and if there are any things that they've been learning, we would like to know what they've been learning about how to handle this material, what kind of things are coming into them, and the challenges that they're facing.
Well, there's a million things I could say about challenges, starting from cataloging to preservation of archives to, you know, the amount of problems and difficulties that we've been facing is huge and ongoing, in the sense that they don't seem to get resolved either. The issue about what cataloging system to use, what cataloging software to use, what subject cataloging system to use, all of these things. I've got a presentation coming up. I'm not sure what the date of it is. Is it next week or the week after? So soon, anyway. Maybe that would be the better place to sort of, for me to present the problems and to get some feedback from other people, rather than trying to drag it all into a tail end of a conversation here.
Okay, I put you on the spot, but I realize you have something coming up, so that's great. We'll hear from you then.
Oh, thanks. Well, so we'll leave it there as an advertisement for Mujan's presentation in a few weeks' time. Well, thank you all for coming online for this this session, and we look forward to seeing you again next time around. Bye bye for now.